Almost every village now has its own warehouse or depot, and the village office is also the branch of the bank. The cooperative bank makes loans to cocoa marketing societies through their district unions, and these give seasonal credit to their members, which is repaid at harvest time. The farmer's cocoa is taken from the village drying mat to the society's shed, where the beans are weighed, honest weights, tested for quality, and graded. The farmer is paid on the spot. The part of the money he wants to draw, the balance is left as a deposit, which he draws later in bits as he needs it. Cooperative marketing business is efficient, democratic, and popular. That is why it is successful. The society's lorry takes the cocoa to the union warehouse, and from there, the cocoa goes down to the coast, from where most of it is.
This is something of the war effort from the Gold Coast of West Africa, manufacture of soap from cocoa beans. Something of a surprise item for our American visitors who think we make our coffee from soap. Unfortunately, it all looks rather a mess, but so do most processes of manufacture at some stage or the other, and anyway, you don't have to eat it. There's no point in going into a long description of what they're doing or how it's done, because you're never likely to get enough cocoa beans to do it at home. But it's nice to see that the war effort is being pushed ahead, even in these remote corners of our empire. Sappers of the Gold Coast Regiment training in the important job of getting transport across rivers. Since this war started, we've seen many pictures of making pontoon bridges and crossing streams in collapsible boats. Undoubtedly, it's a vital adjunct of military tactics, but there's no doubt that when we get to Venice, it'll seem like a home from home.
This is the Gaumont British News, presenting the world to the world. Church House, Westminster, sees the official opening of Britain's first colonial mount, with a governor's escort of Gold Coast police forming a guard of honor for the arrival of the King and Queen.
Nkrumah's hopes for colonial independence had begun during World War II. United States President Franklin Roosevelt had secured from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill a promise that all nations of the world would be allowed to chart their own political course. Churchill didn't realize it at the time, but it was the beginning of the end for European colonialism.
A new power was on the world scene, the United States of America. And it faced a world which had already been containerized by the European powers. And it said, open up, unlock, we want in. And that unlocking was independence from the American point of view.
As World War II drew to a close, the United Nations was formed. It would provide a forum where nations could meet to address issues of mutual concern. Among the founding principles of this new organization was a declaration of support for political freedom and independence. The colonial powers of Europe vastly underestimated the power this would have.
When I first joined the UN in 1945, I was astonished at particularly the British Foreign Office. And people would say, well, decolonization is a small matter, you know, 100 years, 150 years, maybe. Well, actually, it took 20.
Colonialism, of course, is the absolute enemy of open economies and of free trade. Colonialism is about anything. It's about managing economies, restricting access, either formally or informally. And it emphasizes the importance of Africa as a producer of raw materials.
Known to Europeans and Americans for centuries as the Dark Continent, by the late 1880s, European nations had colonized virtually all of Africa. In 1884, they met in Berlin to draw up the political boundaries of their colonies. These boundaries seldom had much to do with the realities of Africa.
This, of course, meant that in some instances they split peoples. In other instances, it meant that people who had been fighting each other before the map was drawn, were now put into one administrative unit. Of course, the Europeans could all play on that in order to keep the peace.
During the Second World War, the Europeans had recruited their colonial subjects to the war effort. African conscripts were not always well treated. In 1948, in the Gold Coast's capital, Accra, disgruntled ex-soldiers demonstrated for fair pay for their wartime service. A number were shot and killed by colonial police, sparking riots across the country. One of those imprisoned without trial in the aftermath of the rioting was Kwame Nkrumah. He had just returned from England to be General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention Party. Nkrumah's arrest instantly transformed him into a national hero. The Gold Coast was one of the richest colonies in Africa. Diamonds, gold, and cocoa were its main exports. Its early history was dominated by the slave trade. Nkrumah himself came from a small village near the old slaving forts of Elmina. In the 1930s, he managed to make his way to the United States to study. While in the U.S., he was influenced by African-American scholars and black nationalist pioneers.
In British West Africa, the Gold Coast produced 1/3 of the world's cocoa beans. Africans still ran their own farms, but British companies like Cadbury's held the real power.
Their standards of quality are so high that nowadays the Gold Coast natives refer to the best of anything as Cadbury quality.
To keep costs low for British buyers, the government fixed the cocoa price, though it wasn't presented in quite that way.
All the cocoa nowadays is bought by the government, so that a steady price is given to the farmer and he's protected from the violent price changes which used to occur.
Anima Sifo grew up on a cocoa farm.
There were a lot of British companies in the cocoa business. They sent their agents out to buy cocoa from the villages. We didn't have our own scales for weighing the beans, so we were really cheated by the agents. We had to accept the prices they gave us. The price was set by the British, and we had no say. Our hands were tied.
The Europeans needed the Africans for the work they could do. They were in no hurry to give them full political rights. At best, the British and French thought Africans might one day run their own internal affairs, but it might take 50 years. The Belgians and Portuguese couldn't conceive of this ever. The aspirations of Africans themselves changed after the end of the Second World War, which altered everything. Colonial troops had fought alongside the British to defend other parts of the empire. They became more aware of the world.
From the jungles of Burma, tough veteran West and East African troops arrive at Bombay on their way home. And their fighting skills struck terror into the Japanese. They were masters of jungle warfare.
They'd learned something else. In India, they'd seen the nationalists challenging the British. Geoffrey Aduama returned to the Gold Coast with a new insight.
Well, the Indians were very, very political. They were very political. We had conversation with some of them. They said, why are we fighting for Britain? Then we say we are fighting for world freedom. So they ask us, are you yourself free? We said, no. I said, well, fight for your freedom first. As I said, this had a very big impression on the Gold Coast soldiers. Me especially, it had a big impression on me.
The African struggle for self-rule, which would soon spread to other parts of the continent, began in the British colony of the Gold Coast, where only 5,000 Britons, mostly traders, lived alongside 2 million Africans. Trouble began when demonstrations led by army veterans turned into violent riots, and 29 were killed. The protests were turned into a mass movement by Kwame Nkrumah, a charismatic campaigner known as Iron Boy. He founded a political party and told Africans, "We have the right to govern ourselves." Following Gandhi, he asked Africans to take direct action and demand self-rule immediately. He organized a boycott of British goods and a general strike. The British saw him as a dangerous firebrand, probably under communist influence, and put him in prison. The jailing of Nkrumah gave a new impetus to the campaign to replace rule by the governor through African chiefs with an elected government.
Victory for us in the struggle of CPP. There is victory for us. Forward, ever, backward, never. In the name of great CPP, there is victory.
Komla Bedama, Nkrumah's friend and fellow worker, ran the party in his absence.
To prove not only to the colonial officials,
I had to organize the party around the country at the same time as keeping the machinery of the party going. But we did it all. And to help us do it, one of the tools I used was to have a full life-size photograph of Nkrumah made into 3 parts so that it makes a decent small parcel. And this I carried around as part of my paraphernalia for the campaign. Nkrumah's body is in jail, but his spirit is going on. Now, how can we not vote for such a man?
The mass action brought results. With the colony in ferment, the British finally agreed to a general election. They hoped Nkrumah would lose to more conservative opponents. In 1951, the Gold Coast voted for the first time ever for their own local assembly. There were few white voters. Because of the climate, few Europeans stayed for long or settled in the country. Nkrumah's party won a landslide victory. Reluctantly, the governor had to release him from jail. Now Nkrumah would fight for complete independence.
At Accra, a huge crowd cheers as Kwame Nkrumah leaves James Fort Prison freed by the governor as an act of grace on the eve of the inauguration of the new constitution. In the recent elections, the communist-inspired Convention People's Party secured 34 out of 38 seats. The party's policy is self-government now. Already they demand all 8 seats open to Africans in the cabinet. They're prepared to accept office only to further their own ends. What now happens in the Gold Coast may influence all West Africa.
We begin in West Africa, one of the 2 great areas of the world where we have ruled but never settled.
To the people of the Gold Coast, there came last week a day that will always be remembered in their history. For here, in what's been a British colony for more than a century, nearly 1 million people went to the polls in their first general election. The main issue in the election lay between those who want self-government sometime in the future and those who want it now, like the Convention People's Party, the CPP. Their leader, Kwame Nkrumah, spent election day in jail, serving a sentence for incitement and sedition.
Nkrumah's rise had been irresistible. After spending 10 years in America as a student, he had returned to the Gold Coast in 1947. Within 2 years, he had formed a political party. 2 years after that, he swept to power. Although the British still controlled trade, defence and foreign policy, he had become the first black African Prime Minister.
Nkrumah, before coming into power, has, in his election manifesto, had made certain promises about development, about turning the country into a modern industrial country. Nkrumah very much believed that for development, power was necessary, that you had to have power, that without power you couldn't develop.
Power meant electricity, and the source was to be the giant Volta River that flowed through the eastern half of the country. Ever since the 1920s, the British had planned to build a dam there. A hydroelectric plant would produce electricity to make aluminium from the Gold Coast's vast reserves of the mineral bauxite. In the early 50s, Britain was desperate for a cheap source of aluminium, and Nkrumah joined with the British to resuscitate the scheme.
This is the Volta, the greatest natural resource of the Gold Coast, whose latent power is the mainspring of the most visionary development project in the whole of Africa. And this is bauxite, which lies in millions of tons beneath the green forested hills of the Gold Coast. From this red earth, man can extract the shining wonder metal of today, aluminium. And that is the aim of the Gold Coast, to cap the march to independence with a dramatic leap into the age of technology.
The British authorities saw the power from the dam simply as a means to boost the empire's supply of aluminium. But for Nkrumah it was much more. He saw it as the key to fulfilling his country's destiny.
The power was originally conceived just for the manufacture of aluminum in this country. But then when Kwame came, he gave a new accent, a new importance to that power project. That was, the power was to be used for a comprehensive economic development of the country.
Together, Nkrumah and the British organised a travelling exhibition to promote the Volta scheme. Large models of the dam were built and taken round the country amidst a blaze of publicity. The exhibition was seen by nearly 2 million people.
Some elderly folks, their reaction was first, is it possible, is it feasible for this to happen in their lifetime? And I remember in one particular place, there was one farmer who came in the cloth and did ask the question, what can he do to help for the project to come on?
The two mobile cinemas ranged the country ahead, showing films to audiences large and small, wherever they could find them, showing how great rivers can create prosperity for the people who live beside them.
The exhibition was a great success, and it helped Nkrumah consolidate his political position. But to his opponents, whom he had defeated in the election, the Volta scheme was a dangerous trap, just another cycle in the British exploitation of their country.
The British people were anxious to give us that scheme. And one thing I must make clear, the scheme was not started by Nkrumah. The Volta River scheme was an old scheme of a British government.
In 1953, Nkrumah's opponents forced a debate in Parliament. In a series of speeches, the opposition MPs warned that Nkrumah was in danger of enslaving the country to powerful interests far beyond his control.
As a long-term scheme, it is excellent. But as a short-term scheme, Mr. Speaker, it is suicidal. I would say that no nation which is beginning to free itself puts its neck in a position in which it will find itself in economic slavery.
At the end of the debate, Nkrumah defended his partnership with the British. "We are not boys," he said. "Do you think I am a fool to enter into a project like this blindly? I am not so damn silly as to put my nose into something that is detrimental to this country."
All my life, I've been a man of peace, working for peace, striving for peace, negotiating for peace. But I'm utterly convinced that the action we have taken is right.
In 1956, Britain invaded Egypt to to prevent President Nasser from nationalizing the Suez Canal. Within 10 days, the United Nations and the Americans forced them to retreat. Suez symbolized the decline of Britain's colonial power. Vast projects like the Volta Dam began to look increasingly insecure in the face of confident new African leaders. And Britain was running out of money. That same year, Nkrumah's government was told the Volta scheme was shelved.
Nkrumah had received the news that the British government intended to pull out of the scheme because the finances were getting too large for them to handle.
He was almost in despair. Everybody was depressed. All of those of us who were involved in it in any way were shattered when we discovered that the project was on the shelf. And Nkrumah, but Nkrumah was not a man to allow depression to take over.
In the Gold Coast, Nkrumah had formed his own political party and won a massive majority in 1956 elections. This resulted in getting the British to agree to grant independence in March of the following year. The United States' interest in Africa was at a peak, and a number of prominent Americans attended the independence celebrations. These included then Vice President Richard Nixon and Dr. Martin Luther King.
Citizens of the new state of Ghana gather for the celebration marking their Day of Freedom from colonialism. What was once the Gold Coast, a British colony, now becomes an independent Commonwealth. Vice President and Mrs. Nixon represent the United States at the three-day festivities. Native dances and games mark an event of historic importance since Ghana becomes the first Negro colony in Africa to gain its freedom. Premier Kwame Nkrumah chats with Representative Adam Clayton Powell of the U.S. as Ghana's new army passes in review before the American-educated Premier and Deputy Secretary Ralph Bunche of the United Nations. Another feature of the occasion is a beauty contest in which the fairest of the land compete. And here is Miss Ghana herself, first queen of a brand new republic.
The people of the Gold Coast had had their own assembly under the British, but not independence. In 1957, they became the first black Africans to get complete freedom. Leaders from East and West came to Accra to see the handover. Vice President Nixon represented the United States. He arrived with a delegation that included civil rights leader Martin Luther King.
A new order is coming into being and an old order is passing away. It seems to me that this is fit testimony to the fact that eventually the forces of justice triumph in the universe, and somehow the universe itself is on the side of freedom and justice.
The British were proud of the peaceful nature of the transfer.
For Dr. Nkrumah, main architect of Ghana's independence, this is a day of fulfillment. The longing to be free, the need to be free, these are part of the rightful heritage of man, a heritage denied to colonial Africa until now.
The Gold Coast was renamed Ghana, with a parliamentary system modelled on Westminster. Committing themselves to civil rights, the new government put up a huge commemorative arch.
Here, but a handful of years ago, men laid down their lives for a cause that was not yet won, for freedom, for justice.
Komla Bedema had been with Nkrumah from the start. Now he shared the glory.
And in the subdued light, we mounted the platform and were all ready when the lights all went on at 5 minutes to 12. With me standing on the right-hand side of Nkrumah, everybody was happy. The cheering probably is still resounding, but we don't hear it.
At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. I want you all, those who have hats on, to take off your hats and let the band play our national anthem. And from now on, that national anthem is the national anthem of the Gogo, to be played on all occasions.
The song of the night was called Freedom High Life, written by E.T. Mensah, the king of African high life music.
On the 6th of March 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first black African country to be free.
Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. We are going to demonstrate to the world, to the other nations, young as we are, that we are prepared to lay our own foundation.
Out of the darkness, the pledge and the promise.
The promise of independence was not just going to be just freedom, but that people will see it in their lives. A promise that we are going to industrialize the country as a means of generating growth, economic growth. And industrialization means that we must have power. And therefore, the first thing was that all of us should harness all our resources to get the power established.
It was a glorious moment for Ghana and for Nkrumah.
Jolly, merry and gay, the 6th of March, Independence Day.
Nkrumah took advantage of the moment to call for freedom throughout Africa.
Our independence is meaningless unless it's linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
At independence, everybody was excited. It was unbelievable. Everyone expected great things to happen. We're going to rule ourselves, decide on our own programs for education, for health, social services, improve agriculture, and industrialize our economy. So it was, the sky was the limit.
Ghana, we had our freedom. Ghana, land of freedom. Toils of the brave and the sweat of the labor. Toils of the brave which have brought results. Toils of the brave and the sweat of their labor. Toils of the brave which have brought results.
It's very great that day at the Independence Square. People are dancing, singing. They love the music and the song.
The song really symbolizes the saying of Nkrumah, at long last, the battle is ended.
Because we have freedom. We have our freedom.
Ghana, we now have freedom. Ghana.
It was a glorious moment for Ghana and for Nkrumah. But in private, he knew that many of the promises on which he had been swept to power might prove dangerously hollow if the dam were not built. It was the key to his vision of leading Africa into a shining tomorrow.
Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!
But then, 4,000 miles away, a simple twist of fate brought the Volta scheme back to life. At the end of 1957, Nkrumah's finance minister, Komla Bedema, went to America on a private visit.
I was invited to Maryland State College to give a talk on the newly independent Ghana. And as I was driving there from New York, I felt like having a drink of orange juice or water at a roadside restaurant, Howard Johnson's restaurant in Delaware. My secretary, who was an American, a black American, told me, Minister, I think this is one of the states where they are very sticky about color. I said, what?
The home of good food is Howard Johnson's.
Howard Johnson's is such a friendly place to have good food.
I asked for 2 glasses of orange juice. The girl looked at us, said, no, sir, you can't. I said, what? You can't. Then she turned away, went in and told the manager to come and speak to us. So the manager came and said, gentlemen, I'm sorry, because of your color, you can't drink in here. And I said to him, look, there are people here who are lower social status than I am, but they can drink and I can't. Okay, you can keep the orange juice and the change, but you haven't heard the last of this. Next morning, it was world news all over the world.
Well, during the course of breakfast with the president, he wanted to know how it all happened, so I told him...
During breakfast, he asked me, what were you doing in the United States? I said, I have come here to talk about the Volta project. How's that project, he asked. I said, well, we've put it in cold storage because we can't find the money immediately. Have you talked to the State Department, he said. No, we haven't. Dick, Richard, will you take care of that? And that was how the Volta project came back to life so soon.
Nkrumah seized the opportunity. He wrote to Eisenhower asking for help in building the dam. Eisenhower invited him to visit America. At their meeting in March 1958, he told Nkrumah that the best way to get the scheme started again would be to involve American industry.
The Kaiser Aluminum Hour.
Eisenhower contacted Edgar Kaiser. He was head of one of the largest aluminium corporations in the world.
Kaiser Aluminum, the bright star of metal.
Kaiser was based in Oakland, California. It had mines and smelting plants throughout the world. It promoted aluminium as the shining, lightweight metal of the future.
Presenting aluminum, in a demonstration of those remarkable properties that have made it the favorite of millions. Aluminum is famed for its lightness.
At Eisenhower's request, Edgar Kaiser flew from California to meet Nkrumah in New York.
We were staying at the Waldorf Towers, and Edgar came in, and he and Nkrumah stood and looked at each other, and some kind of magnetic quality passed between them. It was quite remarkable. They took to each other at once. And I doubt if that electricity ever evaporated throughout their experience, although they had many set twos in one way or another.
You are watching a scene which may well be historic. The date, December 1958. The place, Accra, Ghana. The occasion, the rallying of people from a whole continent to discuss what may become a new USA, a United States of Africa.
Already being hailed as the father of African nationalism, Nkrumah gave funds to other nationalist movements and preached the message across the continent.
This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Following independence, Ghana became a magnet for nationalist leaders from all over Africa. And Nkrumah hosted a series of conferences aimed at building support for a united Africa.
That brought in almost all the freedom fighters from Africa. South Africa, Rhodesia, East Africa, North Africa. These first crop of leaders, they were all attending the African freedom fighters conferences.
I appeal to you in the sacred name of Mother Africa to leave this conference resolved to rededicate yourselves to the speedy liberation of your territories.
Last-minute preparations before the conference begins, there lie long years of work and struggle for the advancement of African independence. Yesterday, these countries, now meeting in Accra, were far apart. Often they were divided against each other. Today, they are one. Names are changing. Ideas are changing too. Here begins, in unity, a new Africa. Ethiopia, Ghana, Liberia, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, United Arab Republic. Strong with the onward drive of liberation. Peaceful because independent. United because free. Only South Africa, although invited, does not attend. A year ago, Ghana welcomed the statesmen of the world to celebrate her own independence. Today, this country is proud to welcome the statesmen of free Africa. Each head of delegation, as he arrives, is received by Prime Minister Nkrumah and his colleagues. The first, President Tubman of Liberia, meets Ghana cabinet ministers Mr. Krobo Eduse, Mr. Kofi Baku, Mr. Benson, and the British High Commissioner, Sir Ian McClellan. To the spokesman of Free Africa, units of the Army of Ghana present a guard of honor. They symbolize here a new idea, breaking from the colonial past, that the defense of Africa should be undertaken by Africans and for Africans. Flying in from Addis Ababa is Prince Saleh Selassie Haile Selassie. He is leader of the Ethiopian delegation and personal representative of His Majesty, the Emperor of Ethiopia. Prince Saleh is not a newcomer to Ghana. It's little more than a year since he brought to Ghana's independence celebrations the good wishes of his country. The United Arab Republic, which stands at the crossroads of Africa and Asia, sends its foreign minister, Dr. Mahmoud Fawzi. He has come, like other delegates from North Africa, across the Sahara. For long a barrier to African unity, but today a bridge. Then comes Foreign Minister Sayed Mohamed Ahmed Maju, who leads the delegation of the Republic of the Sudan. From Tunisia, Dr. Sadek Moukadam, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. From the Kingdom of Libya, there comes Foreign Minister Wakbi El Bouri. Through delay from bad flying weather, the 8th delegation and its leader, that of Morocco with Foreign Minister Ahmed Balafrej at its head, will arrive in a few hours' time during the night. Freedom Day, the 15th day of April, 1958. Mrs. Fatia Nkrumah accompanies the Prime Minister to the inaugural session. On the steps of Parliament House, the Prime Minister welcomes each head of delegation as he arrives for the beginning of the conference. Among the first is Foreign Minister Ahmed Balafrej of Morocco. Today, he and his fellow statesmen will affirm the wish and will of African peoples everywhere to unite their efforts towards building and rebuilding in freedom the last colonial continent. They will be speaking in the names of more than 70 million Africans. But what they say and do will be listened to and watched by countless other Africans who are still second-class citizens, or not even citizens at all, in the countries of their birth. Every part of the world, will listen and watch. Non-African powers, great and small, have sent their greetings and good wishes. Brother African peoples who cannot be represented at this conference, but will surely be represented at the next, add their support and encouragement. Among them the Great Federation of Nigeria, Somaliland, Algeria. This scene for all Africa, free or unfree, will not be forgotten. For Dr. Nkrumah, this is a moment when great plans come true.
Leaders and representatives of the government of the African independent states, fellow Africans, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasant duty on behalf of the government and people of Ghana to welcome you, our distinguished guests, to our country. We are deeply grateful and highly honored to have among us such eminent statesmen of free Africa. We hope that your stay in our midst will be happy and enjoyable. And we pray that divine providence will bless and guide our deliberations so that we may arrive at decisions which will be to the mutual benefit of the peace, happiness, and prosperity of our various countries.
For long years, men in Africa have hoped for a meeting such as this, and so it's a high point in African history.
Had the miseries of our continent ended with the slave trade, we might perhaps have found a means of recovering from the wounds which this system inflicted upon us. But alas, a new misfortune, colonialism, befell us. While the slave trade took away from Africa shiploads of our people, colonialism enslaved them in their own territories. We repudiate and condemn all forms of racialism. For racialism not only injures those against whom it is used, but warps and perverts the very people who preach and protect it. And when it becomes a guiding principle in the life of any nation, as it has become in some other parts of Africa, then that nation digs its own grave. It is inconceivable that a racial minority will be able forever to maintain its totalitarian domination over an awakened majority. We, the independent states of Africa, seek to eliminate racialism by our own example of a tolerant, multiracial community reflecting the freely expressed will of the people based upon universal adult suffrage. Africa is the last remaining stronghold of colonialism. Unlike Asia, there are on the continent of Africa more dependent territories than independent sovereign nations. Therefore, the free, independent states of Africa have a responsibility to hasten the total liberation of Africa. I believe
the Prime Minister speaks of the responsibility which the independent states of Africa also feel towards the cause of world peace. He calls for an end to the testing of nuclear weapons. He condemns any plan there may be for using the Sahara as an atomic testing ground. He appeals to the United Nations to halt any such threat to African safety. Today, he says, we are one. An injury to one is an injury to all. From this conference must go out a new message. Hands off Africa. Africa must be free. Prince Saleh of Ethiopia brings a special message from his father, the Emperor. It is the duty of the great and free nations assembled here today, he declares, to ensure that the weight of Africa's prestige and power is enlisted on the side of peace. As an integral part of Africa, Ethiopia looks back with pride on the role she's played in the history of Africa's development. This conference is thinking not only of the interests and future of its 8 members. It is concerned to show the rest of the world that for the African continent a new chapter has begun, a chapter called equality. This wider meaning is underlined by President Tubman of Liberia.
The eyes of the world and all Africa are focused upon us and our deliberations at this time. What we do and what we achieve will either reflect credit to the peoples of this continent or justify the assertion that the African is incapable of managing alone his own affairs. I pay special tribute to the vision and forethought Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Prime Minister of Ghana, for having proposed this conference, the first of its kind in the history of Africa, for the purpose of providing a forum for the free and unfettered exchange of views on any matters which are of interest to individual African states or to all peoples of Africa,
The customary atmosphere of Parliament House, one of dignity and responsibility, is emphasized as delegate after delegate speaks of the dominant problems of Africa today. Note of energy and confidence in the future, delegates meet for their closing session. Mr. K.A. Bedimer, leader of the Ghana delegation, thanks them for the many good things they've said of his country for its pioneering work.
The conference is now ending, and our guests will soon be departing for their homes. When we next meet, which at the invitation of the Ethiopian delegation will be in Addis Ababa, we shall look forward to seeing delegates from those territories like Algeria, Somaliland, and the Federation of Nigeria sitting side by side with us and taking a full part in our deliberations.
Ghana started with good prospects. The country was rich from cocoa and gold.
Today, Ghana is a land of the future, and Accra, its capital, a fine modern city.
Once they'd achieved political freedom, all Africans expected tangible improvements to their lives. They wanted economic freedom as well. In Ghana, hopes were high.
Do you think better now?
It's far better than before. Far better.
Do you make more money now?
Yes, please. Make more money. Our trade is on successfully, and we feel happy now than before.
We are happy in everything on account of the independence.
Ghana had all the trappings of a new nation. A brand new airline was training its own pilots. Communications were better.
Hello, London. Hello, London.
Ghana Airways, roads, schools, colleges, universities, harbors, everything. Buildings. You see, these estate houses were all built by Nkrumah for the poor. And you see some poor people now having a house to live in. Education. People like me couldn't have been a lawyer It's impossible. But when Nkrumah came, he opened the doors for everybody.
Before 1961, the Black Stars, as the Ghanaian national team are known, had been coached by Europeans. As part of his plan to Africanize national life, Nkrumah brought back Charles Gyamfi, who was playing in Germany for Fortuna Düsseldorf, to become national coach. He and the players all had direct access to the head of state.
Being a star within the Black Star, I can always go to him without even making an appointment. I go to him. If I'm in need of anything, I go to him and tell him.
The Black Stars became the ambassadors of Ghana, spreading Nkrumah's gospel of Pan-Africanism.
Stanley Matthews, the ageless wizard, takes the field once again. But in case you hadn't noticed, it's not Blackpool he's playing for this time. The scene is Accra Stadium, and his teammates are the Hearts of Oak, Ghana's leading side. Over the bar, but never mind, in a few minutes Stanley's back again, as slippery as ever. A teammate grabs the pass, the goalie runs out, but he dodges him and the goal's wide open. All the spectators are cheering for Stanley, the uncrowned king of soccer. Uncrowned? The Hearts of Oak soon put that right.
Ikeja Airport, and the drummers and the banners were out to welcome an important visitor, Prime Minister Dr. Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. The plane was delayed an hour by engine trouble in Accra, but when Dr. Nkrumah eventually arrived, he received a warm welcome from the Prime Minister of the Federation, Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. The Guard of Honor, 48 strong, was found by the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Own Nigeria Regiment, who brought their mascot along. Dr. Nkrumah carried out the inspection, his first official duty of a visit which was to last 12 days. After his stay in Lagos, tours were to be made of the 3 regions and the Cameroons. It was a fine opportunity for the Prime Minister to see how life is lived in a country soon to follow in the independent steps of his own. And wherever he went, the 49-year-old Prime Minister of Ghana received a warm welcome from the students.
Some of our Nigerian brothers have been deported since independence. I wish to make it quite clear that those who have been deported because their conduct was found to be inimical to the security of the state. We could not detain them under the Preventive Detention Act. We could only, with painful reluctance, deport them.
When he returned to Lagos from his visit to the regions and the southern Cameroons, Dr. Nkrumah held a press conference at Ikeja Airport.
Initiate or establish in Ghana the institutions of...
so many. I give an instance. For example, your administrative school at Zaria has very much impressed me. But I've always believed in, local government as the basis of all, democratic setup. And that's really impressed me, and I think it's a thing which Ghana should copy. You have a government, local government school, you see, but it doesn't go that far. It's only for local government administrators, but you have really a broad base for it, and that really impressed me very much. That's one instance I can give.
This visit by the Prime Minister of a neighboring state had been a great success. Dr. Nkrumah left with a clear appreciation of the Nigerian way of life. The friendships he had made and the discussions which took place will obviously be of great value to both countries. The Federal Prime Minister walked with him to the Ghana Airways plane, which was to fly him home to Accra. Before he boarded the aircraft, there were more farewells to be taken for many new friends there were to wish him bon voyage. The visit had been successful from all points of view. The 12-day tour was over, but the benefits which will spring from it in the years to come cannot yet be estimated.
Ghana is a land of the future. Accra's international airport serves the major airlines.
At the end of 1958, a team of Kaiser executives and engineers flew to Accra to look at the plans for the scheme.
And at the end of the journey, a modern city.
Nkrumah offered the Kaiser team a deal. If they agreed to build an aluminium smelter in Ghana, then his government would be able to raise the money for the dam. In return, the dam would supply the large quantities of electricity needed by the plant. The rest would go to power the future industries of the new Ghana. To the Kaiser team, Ghana seemed an attractive prospect.
It was wealthy. I think they had $400 million in the bank. Very highly educated. Every driver was reading the newspaper. I mean, they were very literate people, and it was as good a place to try in Africa as you could go to.
They were aggressive. There was one young lawyer who impressed me, who became great friends, Ron Sullivan. He was very aggressive, and they were later on got to understand what they were doing. That was their nature. Unlike the British, who were very gentlemanly, the Americans were straight to the point and no frills or wrapping up the... They call a spade and a shovel.
They wanted the dam. And we were the means to get it because we were the way that the dam was being financed.
It had always been assumed by the Ghanaians that, as with the British scheme, the smelter would use the vast reserves of their own bauxite and so create an important new industry. But in the middle of the negotiations, the Kaiser team made it clear they had no intention of using Ghana's bauxite for the time being. Instead, they would import the raw materials needed by the smelter from America. The decision shocked the Ghanaian negotiating team.
They might have been disappointed, but you have to realize that wasn't that high grade of bauxite. It was high 30s or low 40s, and the bauxite, for example, over in Guinea was 55%. Makes a lot of difference in cost. It just wasn't possible at that time.
This seemed to be totally wrong to Nkrumah. He was intensely upset. He could never believe that Ghana's bauxite couldn't be converted by a series of processes into pots and pans and roofing sheets.
What the Kaiser executives didn't tell the Ghanaians was that there was another reason why they didn't want to use the local bauxite.
We were greatly concerned that if we located within Ghana all of the bauxite and power necessary to have an integrated aluminum operation, that someday our project, if it were profitable, might be nationalized by the government and taken away from us.
The Kaiser team refused to change their minds. They knew as well as Nkrumah did that without them there would be no dam. At the end of 1959, Nkrumah told his team to agree to Kaiser's terms. Millions of dollars worth of Ghanaian bauxite would remain in the ground. But with Kaiser's letter of intent in his pocket, Nkrumah knew he could now set about raising the money to build the dam. He approached the World Bank. It had been set up at the end of the war to provide loans to rebuild Europe, but now it had turned its attention to the Third World. He asked the bank for £30 million. It was the largest loan ever requested. Yet the bank's economists believed, as Nkrumah did, that electricity was the key to industrial development in the Third World.
We envisage the development of this power resource as fundamental to Ghanaian economic development. The provision of power, electric power to Ghana, was an immense economic benefit to the country, was a sine qua non of economic development in the country. So let's accept that the economic benefits for power to Ghana were tremendous.
The belief that science and technology applied on a grand scale would somehow inevitably propel a third world country into the industrial age was the prevailing wisdom of the time. It was called the theory of takeoff. It gripped the imagination of politicians and economists both in the West and in the Third World. In June 1960, the World Bank approved the scheme in principle. but its report had important reservations. The most serious concerned the price Kaiser paid Ghana for electricity. The World Bank made it clear that if Nkrumah was to get the benefits he expected from the dam, he must negotiate a certain minimum rate for the power. If he didn't, Ghana might find it difficult to take off.
Our report essentially was saying to Ghana, this project will succeed and we're prepared to make a loan on it, and the loan can be paid out if the power price is right. This was absolutely the key to the negotiations.
As a conductor of electricity, it's hard to beat.
But Kaiser needed a low rate if the smelter was to be profitable. A second round of negotiations began.
In toughness and adaptability, it can be made as strong as structural steel.
Nkrumah faced a terrible dilemma. His advisors and the World Bank told him that if he accepted the price Kaiser was offering, the high expectations he had of the dam might not be realized. But if he refused, Nkrumah knew that Kaiser would pull out and the dam would never be built.
Nkrumah was a man besieged. He had to do something. As you know, he had raised up hopes of the development of the country, that the Volta River project would turn Ghana into a modern industrial country. He had no other program. Insofar as he saw it as providing this minimum of the power which he saw, he was prepared to go along.
The negotiations dragged on through the autumn of 1960. Neither side would give way on the electricity price. Finally, one hot afternoon in December, Edgar Kaiser decided to confront Nkrumah and force the issue.
Kaiser asked for the meeting to be adjourned and went straight to Nkrumah and explained that perhaps his shareholders would not go along with the project if we asked for a higher power rate than Kaiser was asking for. A message came back after lunch, direct from Nkrumah, that we're to go ahead and accept the rate. He wanted the project at all costs.
Kwame Nkrumah and Edgar Kaiser on the 22nd of January 1962 signed the master agreement, which enfolded every provision that was necessary between Edgar Kaiser's company and the Ghana government. When they had signed it, they stood up and clasped each other in a very, very genuine embrace. I was there together with a large number of other distinguished guests, and I don't think any of us will ever forget it. The following day we all went to Akosombo, and Nkrumah let off a vast charge, and the scheme started.
Yes, I suppose you can say Kaiser used Nkrumah, but if that makes Nkrumah passive, that would be inaccurate, because Nkrumah also used Kaiser. The question is, whose end of the bargain came out better? Nkrumah would seem to have been going into an area with so many unknowns. One can say that while he was pursuing power, power slipped through his fingers.
But even as Nkrumah and Edgar Kaiser celebrated, other forces were becoming involved in the scheme. The dam was now a hostage in the vicious confrontations of the Cold War. A year before, the Congo had been torn apart by a brutal civil war. America and the Soviet Union backed opposite sides. The policy of the new Kennedy administration was to fight the spread of communism in Africa. In 1960, Brezhnev, the president of the Soviet Union, had visited Ghana. It frightened America's leaders. They were determined that Nkrumah, despite his brand of African socialism, would be their man.
Nkrumah was everything. He was everything, politically, economically, psychologically, culturally, and so on. He just absolutely dominated the scene.
Nkrumah, though, wanted to keep Ghana and Africa out of the Cold War.
President and distinct delegates, it's quite clear that a desperate attempt is being made to create confusion in the Congo, extend the Cold War to Africa, and involve Africa in the suicidal quarrels of foreign powers. The United Nations must not allow this to happen.
But there was the dam. The American government realised that it was a powerful weapon with which to ensnare Nkrumah.
Bolstered by the arrival of UN forces, Lumumba visited his increasingly socialist mentor in Ghana.
During that short visit of Lumumba, they signed a union treaty, a very short treaty, which established a union between Ghana and Congo as a beginning.
Kennedy felt increasingly caught in the contradictions.
And one of the crisis flashpoints in Africa for Kennedy was the Congo. Suddenly, we're criticizing Belgium. And these are NATO allies. They're saying, quit criticizing what we're doing there. We're not criticizing what's happening in Alabama, where you're not giving African Americans the right to vote and that people are being killed in haze. Why are you bothering with our colonial problem? And so Kennedy found himself in a real flap. By the end of the Kennedy years, he in many ways sold Africa downriver.
On the 13th of September 1961, the United Nations finally took sides, attempting to end the Katanga secession.
Like the World Bank, the Kennedy administration had agreed to lend millions of dollars to the scheme. In an internal memorandum, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, made it quite clear what this money was for. By maintaining this leverage on Nkrumah, he wrote, the US will be in a better position to influence his policies. In public, though, it was called foreign aid.
The problem was that we foresaw that the progress that the Soviets were making in extending their communist ideology, particularly in Africa and to some extent in South America, certainly in the Middle East, and that therefore we had to counter that some way. And we countered it with foreign aid as a defense against the spread of communism.
Like most of the new African governments, Ghana adopted a socialist system and believed central planning would bring the fastest improvement for the mass of the population. Nkrumah called his version scientific socialism.
Ghana has made challenging and exciting plans for industrial development. They will attract foreign investment and increase and diversify her production, which has hitherto depended largely on the cocoa crop. The spectacular progress made industrially and financially in Ghana has captured the imagination.
The giant Volta Dam would produce all the electricity the country needed and allow aluminium to be smelted in a new plant as well. But in the rush for development, mistakes were made. Ghanaians soon became victims of bad advice and greed. Huge silos built for the cocoa crop were never used. The aluminium smelter was a financial disaster. When he thought the road schemes were too grandiose, engineer Eddie Francois complained to the president's office.
This did not warrant a 4-lane highway. A 2-lane highway at that time would have been enough. There were other places in Ghana which required that money, and that money wasn't put in the right place. Eventually, a friend of my father called me aside and said, hey, keep your mouth shut. Don't interfere with the politics of this game. At that time, it was felt that there was a bit of a rub-off on the party so that the party could be financially strong.
London. In a world committed to collective security for its future survival, the Commonwealth, through its family circle of nations, must play a leading role. So Mr. Macmillan welcomes Commonwealth Prime Ministers to Downing Street. From Australia, Mr. Menzies greets a newcomer, Mr. Diefenbaker, who brings a Canadian mandate following his recent election victory. Voicing the opinion of the new nation of Ghana is Dr. Nkrumah. A representative from the Far East, Mr. Nehru, joining his sister in London, Mrs. Pandit, the Indian High Commissioner. So, once again, members of a great family gather to iron out past differences while shaping the future policy that can be the hope and the inspiration of all mankind.
African politics was high on the global agenda, with the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, putting the Pan-African sentiments of leaders such as Nkrumah of Ghana center stage. That the finals of the Nations Cup were hosted in and won by Ghana that year was a triumph for both the team and their president. Football, he believed, could be a model for African pride and unity. And in a successful Black Stars team, he had the supreme vehicle.
And on this note of national joy, the Africa Cup Series for 1963 drew to an eventful close, proving to the world that in unity, the African sportsman is a powerful, talented, and inspiring force in the competitive world of sport.
Bit by bit, Nkrumah's utopian vision was slipping away. The Volta scheme had become something very different from what he had originally intended. At every stage, the project had been shaped not by his idealism, but by powerful political and economic pressures. But Nkrumah still believed it was worthwhile, because once the dam was built, it could not be taken away. In time, it would become the engine of his country's future.
Everyone was hopeful. Those absolutely were optimistic times for hope. Ghana was singular in the sense that it had everything. It had educated people, it had considerable infrastructure, 3 universities, schools, lawyers, doctors. It had everything going for it.
And I see and hear springing up cities of Ghana, becoming the metropolis of science, learning, scientific agriculture, and philosophy. Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto it.
We are the nation powerhouse. We supply power to every home. We are the nation powerhouse.
At the heart of Nkrumah's plan was a giant dam that would produce vast quantities of cheap electricity. Enough power to build a modern industrial state in the heart of Africa within a generation. But what Nkrumah did not foresee was that with the dam would come other, more dangerous forms of power which he could not control. Political and economic forces that would tear apart his vision of using science and technology to create a model for the new Africa.
Nkrumah was, in my mind, a visionary, not a dreamer. In his mind's eye, he could see United States of Africa as United States of America. And he could see Africa coming together to form a viable unit, to become a world power in the shortest possible time.
From now on, there is a new African in the world.
He needed power, and there was no source from which he could get the amount of power which he needed. And this was the one source which could provide him with that power. And he was prepared to go the whole length to get it.
The construction of the dam was to take 4 years. Throughout Ghana, factories and roads began to be built, the foundations of the industrial revolution that would be powered by the dam. But with these trappings of the modern world came other forces that took Ghana's fragile economy even further from Nkrumah's control.
Corruption is not a problem peculiar to any country. I personally feel that the only way in which you can stop corruption in a country is to build up a strong public opinion against it.
Elements entered into the equation that had not been adequately foreseen, and perhaps the greatest of them was corruption. Corruption of government and of government people, and corruption, I call it corruption, on the part of foreign suppliers who tried to sell Ghana, in fact did sell Ghana, on investment in substantial industrial enterprises which were not properly designed for the country and did not in fact achieve success.
In the early 60s, Ghana became a mecca for European industrialists eager to win large contracts from Nkrumah's government. They began to discover that the easiest way was to offer officials from Nkrumah's party a bribe. This soon became the accepted way of doing business in Accra. What resulted was a rush to sell Ghana anything, no matter how inappropriate for an emerging African nation. Vast sums of Ghana's precious foreign currency were spent on these projects. Then, in 1964, Nkrumah's industrial experiment received another body blow.
Nkrumah was now gathering all political power into his own hands and building a cult around himself. He was the savior, messiah, redeemer. His picture was seen on shirts, dresses, coins and stamps. Streets were renamed after him. His titles included Chairman of the Central Committee, Prime Minister and General Secretary of the party. Ghana became the first of many one-party states in Africa.
More people have been fined for breaking the curfew imposed last Saturday in the city of Accra. 89 people appeared before a magistrate's court. They all pleaded guilty.
The economic promises weren't delivered, and scientific socialism soon turned into autocracy.
People were afraid to speak their minds. You were spied on. Anything you said against Nkrumah could be written down and they'd come and arrest you. If they arrested you, they didn't ask you about what you'd said. They just sent you to prison. If you were there and you died, you died.
Ghana is passing through a revolutionary period. We cannot, under any circumstances, allow imperialists and new colonialists to interlock with traitors in our midst to deflect us from the path of duty and progress.
Lead kindly light. The hymn sung spontaneously when Kwame Nkrumah launched the Convention People's Party, it now starts off most political rallies.
Positive action was the means by which we exerted political pressure for the achievement of our independence. As we celebrate this eventful day in our history, I come to salute you, the party members. I come to salute you, the party members of our revolutionary party.
This is a one-party state. Its slogan, one people, one party, one leader. The leader is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, President of Ghana, whose African title is Osejifo. The people are the people of Ghana. And Ghana's constitution, clause 1A1 reads, there shall be one national party, which shall be the vanguard of the people in the struggle to build a socialist society, and which shall be the leading core of all organizations of the people. Clause 1A2, the national party shall be the Convention People's Party. Our first reaction to that is that we have seen this all before. It's not merely that having pioneered the two-party system, Britain hoped that it would be followed in Africa. It is also that many of us in our generation have had bitter experience of the one-party state in Europe. But is comparison with Europe fair? Most Africans say no, Africa must not be the prisoner of Europe's history. That what they are trying to do stems from Africa's necessities and must be justified by Africa's history. This is a view which we owe it both to them and to ourselves to examine closely. Not just in Ghana, but all over Africa, the new leaders are saying that the two-party system does not suit African conditions, that a permanent opposition that opposes for opposition's sake is alien to African tradition and damaging to the mood of national mobilization which alone can rouse the people to effort and prosperity. Despite geography, ideology, or leaders' personality, states are going the same way. In the Ivory Coast, a free economy, a pro-French policy, and a one-party state. And next door Ghana, socialist, critical of the West, and a one-party state. In one-party Ghana, following an attempt to assassinate the president, slow-boiling friction between party and university came to a head, with 6 foreign staff members purged and deported. Yet in multi-party Nigeria, when the West Region government changed, university staff members were purged by the new party in office for being too closely associated with the old. Under tribalistic party warfare, says Nigerian President Azikiwe, the personality of the Nigerian nation has decomposed and stinks. Until 1946, our rule was authoritarian via traditional chiefs everywhere except in the coastal areas like Accra, where a small educated elite of African traders and professional men did have a long apprenticeship in self-government. The African upper crust, living in houses like these, expected to take over the Englishman's privileges when he left. And Nkrumah's supporters were the masses of underemployed primary school leavers. His positive action was a social revolution as well as a nationalist movement. Nkrumah united these coastal rebels with the discontented commoners of the Ashanti kingdom. This old gentleman in the bowler is the Attaining of Ashanti, which used to be a strong feudal confederacy in the middle section of Ghana, back from a visit to Britain for the sake of his health. According to one deputy minister, the Attaining political health also benefited because he came back no longer believing in the divine right of kings and prepared to mix freely with his people. In Ashanti and in the upper region, all government used to be conducted in the name of the chief, and they were extravagantly praised. During the transition to independence, the Attaining and other chiefs financed opposition groups which tried to break Ghana up into a loose federation on a tribal basis. Depriving chiefs of political power, Nkrumah assumed the traditional title Asajifo, or super chief of the nation, so as to bridge the change. Ghana exalted the leader not only as political head, but as her equivalent of a royal family.
Nkrumah does no wrong. Nkrumah does no wrong.
A new patriotism was instilled into the young.
Nkrumah does no wrong.
Forever live, forever Nkrumah never die, never die, never die. Nkrumah never die, he forever live.
A mass of competitive unions and associations, many of them inefficiently or corruptly run, were compulsorily merged by statute, so that there should be one organization in each field, with each tied to the party. Ghana's press became very obviously a party press. It has been publicly reproached by one of the president's friends, the Ghanaian philosophy professor Willie Abraham, for unsober adulation of Kwame Nkrumah. Abraham says this hides his real personality from the people. The regime detained some of its enemies without trial, giving the same reason as many colonial governments, that it was often impossible to get witnesses to come forward or to satisfy British laws of evidence in African conditions. Ghana is not a police state in the usual sense. The police have been much in evidence only after the 2 attempts to murder Nkrumah. and the wild rash of bomb throwing among Accra crowds. Nkrumah has yet to execute a single one of his opponents, but he disturbed many of his admirers by dismissing a Chief Justice for failing to tip him off in advance that he was about to acquit 2 ex-ministers, who are now being retried for the same offence.
We all want a united Africa.
Kwame Nkrumah is a man of various moods. Grim urgency is one mood. Nkrumah has a more intensive sense of the enormity of the task African governments have set themselves than any other leader.
Best be solved only on a continental basis.
But this also is Kwame Nkrumah. The boyish charm and personal modesty are part of the essence of the man that gets overpainted by crude propaganda. This happier aspect is clouded when security considerations force him to live in Christiansburg Castle, where he feels cut off from the people and oppressed by thoughts of the slave fort's former use. Then his impatience seems to dominate him totally. Nkrumah has committed much of his prestige to continental union now. I raised the apparent lack of response among the assembled heads of state with one of his advisers, Dr. Bankole Akpata.
All of them, without exception, agree that African unity is desirable, and that only in the union government will be able to move forward more quickly in the modern world. The only thing that some of them were saying was that they needed a little time, that Dr. Kwame Nkrumah would want union now. Some of them said, yes, new union, but we should go step by step. But how can you go step by step when the burning issues of our problems against poverty, against apartheid in South Africa, against Southern Rhodesia and so on, calls and demands now for us to unite our forces? And the facts are there. Take the United States of America with nearly 200 million people, the Soviet Union with 210 million people, the Chinese People's Republic with nearly 700 million people, the subcontinent of India with 450 million people. Africa has only a population of 280 million people. I mean, fragmented and disunited and so on. How can we emerge in the modern technological and scientific world if our disparate forces are going our separate ways? That is why the urgency of union government now cries out for effectual union for us to move forward. I think history and geography are on the side of Kwame Nkrumah.
The modern technological and scientific world is being entered by Ghana with a heavy load of unhelpful history. Nkrumah still does have many of the British administrators' problems: a get-rich-quick outlook, unresponsiveness to government, lack of initiative except at the top. Just glance at Ghana's terrible history. Elmina Castle, the first European building in the tropics, built in 1482 for the purchase and storing of men, women and little children. This first contact of Western Christian civilization with the Africans of what was then known as the Guinea coast was made by the Portuguese, hence the proliferation of Portuguese expressions along this coast: fetish, customs, palaver, pickaninny and dash, the universally used phrase for bribe or just a tip. When the slaving had to stop because Britain's conscience turned, and 50 years later, America's, then the Gold Coast, as this was now called, became a supplier of raw materials for the Western industrialized nation. First gold, then cocoa. Now independent Ghana wants to be industrialized, wants to be socialist. It also places a very high premium upon the dignity and the cultural heritage of the new Africa. And here's an example of what Nkrumah is up against. Without import licensing, the present forced pace of development wouldn't be possible. But as in all West African states with a long history of slave and then colonial trading, Ghana is clogged with corruption. According to this report of the great license scandal, the head of the CID asked for a £15,000 bribe from an Indian importer. At the Ministry of Trade, says Justice Attaining, bribery and corruption were indulged in with impunity. He recommended wholesale transfer of staff. Trade unions have run into a £32,000 deficit while lending their own officials £30,000 to buy cars and houses. Ghana's crash program of economic development has to be accompanied by a crash program of human development. And Nkrumah's view is that only constant drive from the top can hope to stop this morass of apathy and self-advancement and prevent it from fatally impeding Ghana's 7-year plan. Ghana needs, Nkrumah says, a new citizen, modest, honest and informed, a man who abhors greed and detests vanity, a new type of man, whose humility is his strength and whose integrity is his greatness. The task has been given to the young pioneers, organized by Z.B. Shada. Socialism but in a mixed economy. No compulsory nationalization in Ghana, but enterprises bought and started by the state, like this one managed by Sir Patrick Fitzgerald.
I was out here for years in the employment of the United Africa Company, and then brought back to head Ghana National Trading Corporation, and we have a great task to make it like other commercial concerns, and we have already had a very good start.
I notice you've made a profit this last year. Is that typical of the socialist concerns here or exceptional?
It is rather exceptional. I think, in fact, we are the first corporation to donate anything to the 7-year development plan.
Do you, in fact, practice business very much in the same way that it used to, or are there altogether new techniques?
No, that's very much the same as trading has been conducted over the last 40 years here. We distribute goods through about 190 retail outlets all over the country, and we also have what we call here a credit customer organization, which means that we have about 6,000 nearly all Ghanaian women who are traders, who we give goods to on credit. They go and sell them and they bring us the money.
These are the market mammies, are they?
These indeed are the market women.
These private enterprise market mammies are retailers for the state wholesaler and importer. Many of them do £300 or £400 of business a month, although only semi-literate. The most experienced can gross as much as £10,000. They've always been a political force.
In Ghana, are women as important as men or less important?
Oh! Ghana, are the women active than men? We women make active parties. Everything. Fashion market women active.
They make the men active.
Yes, we make men active. If your husband sleeps, you make it up. Get up, let's go.
Ghanaian small businessmen, says Nkrumah, will be encouraged, provided they accept upper limits. This goldsmith is an example. He's moulding the gold over charcoal. Ghana is one of the last great gold cultures. This was the occupation of Nkrumah's father. He sets real scarab beetles in gold earrings instead of the usual artificial ones. The wealth to finance Ghana's modernization so far has come almost exclusively from her private cocoa farmers. No changes in ownership are planned. State farms are being cleared out of the jungle to experiment in large-scale agriculture. Partnership between the Ghana government and foreign private enterprise is a major element in the 7-year development plan. This is the Volta Dam at Akosombo. Talked about for decades, Nkrumah personally deserves the credit for having got it moving at last as soon as he took office. It is the symbol and guarantee of the future he plans for Ghana. The project is ahead of schedule and 75% complete. Ghana herself has supplied half the finances. The rest come from Britain, America, and the World Bank. An American aluminium firm guaranteed in advance to buy a large block of electricity. The consulting engineers are American. The contractor, Italian. An artificial lake will open up communication and commerce with the north of Ghana. Reserves of cheap electricity should spur the industrial revolution for which the present 7-year plan is laying the foundations. Volta itself is a brilliant example of integrated planning. The dam construction is phased in with a brand new artificial harbour and industrial centre at Attaining. Ghana has no natural harbours. This is how, until the last few years, everything had to be landed for Accra on skillfully paddled surfboats. Now commerce is handled at the new port of Tema, the future business capital linked to the political capital 17 miles away at Accra. The economic progress Ghana has made already on a broad front is inspiring. The sophistication of her advanced planning invites admiration. The fervour and dedication of her best leaders are infectious. Ghana seems to do what others talk about. But a few questions remain. First, have not the new ideologists gone rather far overboard with Marxism for a mixed economy? J.H. Mensah, Ghana's chief professional planner, has complained that classic Marxist texts are not much help to him. Secondly, can Ghana promote a continental economic union in time? Ghana's average income is now £80 a year, but Ghana cannot ever jack it up above £200, still well below European level, unless her future industries have continent-wide markets. And thirdly, do Ghanaians pay too high a price for their rate of economic progress in terms of liberal freedoms? Couldn't they, as in Nigeria, go slower and have more democracy? Though in Nigeria, parliamentary methods are now under very great strain. President Nkrumah has alerted the nation about the dangers inherent in governments whose only opposition to tyranny and abuse lies in the folds of the ruling party itself. I do not suppose there is anything new in the world to be said about the inherent dangers of the authoritarian state and the cult of personality. But remember, there are many features of the Ghanaian sea which are special to Ghana and to Africa. Some of the features of the European authoritarian state which are not present here. We must hope then that fears that are based on European experience will prove groundless. For the Ghanaians are a likeable people with whom Britain has had long connections, not always to our credit. And of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, I believe we can say, as was said of another very different kind of reformer, this is a man who tried. From the old Guinea coast, good night.
But by this time, Nkrumah's popularity was declining.
Nkrumah confronted a lot of problems pursuing that agenda. He was seen as a man who had a bloated image of himself, who had a personal agenda to lead Africa and not necessarily to bring the people of Africa together.
The world price of cocoa, which had been falling for 4 years, finally crashed. It was Ghana's main source of foreign exchange. The millions of pounds needed to pay for the new factories began to dry up. Ghana, once one of the richest countries in Africa, began to slide into debt.
Show me the river, take me across, and wash all my troubles away.
Nkrumah was an increasingly isolated figure on the world stage. What had once been seen as visionary ideas were now perceived as dangerous megalomania. And his country was sinking ever deeper into debt.
By 1965, it had become very desperate. And I remember we decided to write a memorandum to Nkrumah to tell him the true state of affairs of the economy. I had written that the reserves were only £500,000. He looked at me and said, you didn't check the typing. You left a few zeros. So I said, no, sir, there are no zeros left. This is 500,000. That's all we have in the banks overseas. And he sat back. Then what he did was that he went round the table. He went to everyone who was seated there, the meeting, and asked them, Frimpong says we have 500,000. Is he right? Do you agree with him? And everybody said yes. That was the first time the whole cabinet acknowledged to the president that Ghana was bankrupt.
The river, take me across and wash all my troubles away. Like the lucky old farm, give me nothing to do. Roll around heaven all day.
Our objective is African Union now. There is no time to waste. We must unite or we perish. I am confident that by our concerted effort and determination...
Kwame Nkrumah was losing both domestically and internationally in his posture. He was practically alone in Flagstaff House. He was really a little bit paranoid. It was really awfully sad. He was even afraid to... I remember they opened their parliament one day, and Nkrumah didn't want to take the chance to drive from Flagstaff House to the Parliament building. He was a prisoner in a sense. You know, there had been a couple of attempts on his life while we were there. So he had reason to be a little bit apprehensive, but toward the end, he was a different person.
On the 22nd of January 1966, the dam was finally finished. Nkrumah organised a massive celebration. He invited the whole country to attend.
The mood of the people at the celebration, the mood of the country was euphoric. There was this vast project which had come in, and they understood it will have a tremendous impact and effect on the country. I felt euphoric. I was quite enthusiastic. I thought a new dawn had come for Ghana.
But all that was happening against the background of a country that already had no money, it had exchange controls, import controls.
And so last Saturday, all was judged ready for a formal inauguration, with young pioneers, acolytes of the new Ghana, and chiefs, cheerfully meaningless relics of the old Ghana, but adding solemnity to the moment of national self-congratulation. And finally, Dr. Nkrumah himself, Asajifo the President, in vice-regal motorcar and sunny mood. This was his dam. He'd borrowed the money, approved the plans, all but built it. Problems were for another day. Budget day, in point of fact, in a fortnight's time, when Ghanaians will learn that they're drastically overspent. But not on the dam, on other, less easily justifiable projects. The dam will pay for itself by the sale of power.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world of contradictions. These contradictions, however, keep the world going. Let me explain what I mean. Ghana is a small but very dynamic independent African state. We are trying to reconstruct our economy and to build a new, free and equal society. To do this, we must attain control of our own economic and political destinies. Only thus can we create higher living standards for our people and free them from the legacies and hazards of a colonial past and from the encroachments of neo-colonialism.
Neo-colonialism, meaning American investment in Africa. His audience knew it was a bad thing. Asajifo had just published a book attacking it. Odd, though, there was American investment in this dam. A further irony, it was that book which made it necessary for Mrs. Nkrumah to open the dam instead of Mrs. Kennedy, as Dr. Nkrumah had hoped. The American government were annoyed by the book and advised Mrs. Kennedy not to go. The fiction that she'd be there was maintained till the last moment, but in the end it was Mrs. Nkrumah who unveiled a plaque marked, "Unveiled by Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy." With Mr. Kaiser engineering and aluminium king, the President then came forward to switch on lights. Mr. Kaiser had spoken, but hadn't explained the other major oddity of the Volta scheme, that the power is to be used to smelt processed bauxite into aluminium, and the processed bauxite is being imported, although Ghana runs over with raw bauxite. But when the lights came on, and the fireworks, these oddities were forgotten in the glow.
So it was just like a big emperor's new clothes. Nobody could say that Ghana was broke, but Ghana really was broke.
President Eisenhower and President Kennedy were genuinely interested in this project because they saw behind the cold figures and the rigid calculations that the Volta River project was not only an economically viable project, but also an opportunity for the United States of America to make a purposeful capital investment in a developing country. You see before you, in all its majesty, strength and power, the Akonsabo Dam, which has tamed the turbulent waters of the Volta.
A lot of us, myself particularly, did not take our seats at the official seating place and watch the ceremony from further uphill. Many reasons for that. One of them was that there was talk of a possible coup at the time.
This is Ghana's Volta River project, a project that is to lead Ghana to a new, brighter, and a more prosperous future.
Is embraced and warmly on his trips behind the Iron Curtain. To the crowds that greet and cheer him, he is a friend and ally, but Nkrumah himself insists that Ghana is neutral and unaligned. On his trips to Russia and other communist bloc countries, the Prime Minister negotiates loans and trade agreements that will finance the increasing number of government-owned industries in Ghana. In barter agreements, Nkrumah exchanges shipments of cocoa for mechanical equipment his country does not need and consumer goods his people do not want. Ghana's economy suffers as her creditors grow. With the passing years, Nkrumah travels anywhere and everywhere searching for economic aid. In Peking, more than 90,000 people turn out to see and to hear Nkrumah lash out at the imperialist nations of the world. But in Nkrumah's own country, changes have taken place that stir uneasiness, distrust, resentment. The man once hailed as the Redeemer, the Savior, has had Ghana's National Assembly make him president for life. The architect of independence now glories in the title of His Messianic Majesty. And all the time Ghana grows poorer and poorer, asking more help, mortgaging more of her cocoa crop. Bankruptcy now threatens the nation that began independence as the richest of all new African states. The commitment to communist nations becomes greater and greater. As he tours and travels, visiting capitals such as Belgrade and leaders such as Marshal Tito, the dreams of the Redeemer go beyond the borders of Ghana. He seeks support for a socialist Africa under one government, one leader, Kwame Nkrumah. While there are those who support and applaud Nkrumah, there are others who see the African leader as a demagogue who will stop at nothing to achieve his own ends. These ends will take him from continent to continent, country to country, city to city, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Coming to the United States on an official visit, the Ghanaian leader will ask for and receive American support for the most ambitious of his construction projects. The historic $400 million Volta River hydroelectric complex will take 4 years to build and will be financed half by Ghana and half by international aid. The man-made miracle will form the world's largest lake and will irrigate 6,000 square miles of new farmland. When the project is finally completed, power-poor Ghana will increase its output by more than 500,000 kilowatts. But Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah pay a high price for the Volta River Dam. The nation, living on cocoa exports and barter deals, comes face to face with bankruptcy in 1965. Cocoa prices skid from 72 to 12 cents a pound. And nations once willing to extend loans and credit turned down Ghana's appeal for emergency aid. Amid this political and economic unrest, Kwame Nkrumah sets out early in 1966 on a Vietnam peace mission to various communist capitals, including Peking. Red China's chairman of state, Liu Shaoqi, is on hand to welcome Nkrumah, along with Premier Zhou Enlai. At the very moment that the official ceremonies are being held, while the flowers are being presented and the cheers ring out, a military coup in Ghana is writing a sudden ending to the rise and fall of Kwame Nkrumah. The Redeemer, the Savior, is now the fallen idol. Newspaper headlines report the spectacular overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, and jubilant crowds celebrate his downfall in the streets of Accra. The military coup in Ghana is the 7th successful revolt in Africa in 9 months. But none of the ousted governments have survived as long as Kwame Nkrumah.
Center stage. For Kwame Nkrumah, the man who had embodied the spirit of hope for black Africans everywhere, there was to be an undignified ending.
From the 60s, my father was preaching very loudly on anti-imperialism and anti-neocolonialism. And this didn't go down well with the Western powers. And so one felt there was also considerable machinations from external forces to topple the government.
In March 1966, while in China en route to Hanoi, Nkrumah was deposed by a military coup.
A military coup in Ghana seems to have been foiled within 4 hours. At 6 o'clock this morning, a broadcast by Accra radio said that a 3-man junta, headed by a colonel in the parachute battalion, had deposed Lieutenant General Joseph Ankara and his 40-month-old National Liberation Council, set up after Dr. Nkrumah's overthrow.
The military regime of Kotoka Ankara Afrifa that assumed economic management of Ghana from 1966 to 1969 did not, for whatever reasons, deviate much from the strategies they inherited.
And he's still got one friend in President Nasser. After Cairo, Nkrumah stopped off in New Delhi to visit India's Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi. They discussed his projected peace mission to North Vietnam. But Nkrumah never got as far as Hanoi. It was on arrival in Peking that Chinese leaders broke the news to Nkrumah of his downfall. Mystery surrounded his immediate plans. Conflicting reports said he was going back to Accra, that he was going to Cairo, that he'd gone to Addis Ababa to appeal to the current Conference of African States. In the end, he flew to Moscow on the way to Guinea. But even the Russians were expected to recognize the new regime. In London, while the government held back from the immediate recognition, Ghanaian students were not holding anything back. Also in London, a Ghanaian who claimed leadership of a so-called Revolutionary Council. He said they had masterminded the coup from a flat in West Kensington. His name, Daniel Amir.
We had the okay yesterday about nearly 10 o'clock. We were ready, all waiting, anxiously waiting and sweating. We gave our order go ahead yesterday in the morning, and in the evening we had the reply that order received and operation is ready, stand by for further instructions.
It was a jaunty Mr. Amir who left London next day, but the attention he received in Accra wasn't quite what he'd had in mind. Whatever revolution was hatched in West Kensington, it seemed, had nothing to do with that dawn coup in Accra. Mr. Amir was branded by the real revolutionaries as a charlatan and a criminal, and he was taken off for a session of public penitence at the first news conference called by Ghana's new rulers. Their leader, General Arthur Ankara, father of 22 and former mission schoolteacher, a man who's never concealed his dislike of Nkrumah. Before dealing with Mr. Amir, he had more important business.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to introduce my colleagues to you, some of the members of the National Liberation Council. As you've already been told, I need no introduction myself. But on my left here is the Commissioner of Police, Mr. Harley, who is the Deputy Chairman of the National Liberation Council. On my right is Major General E.K. Kotoka, who is the second member or the first member of the National Liberation Council. We have called you here this morning for one specific reason, and that is you've heard the name of one Amuhia who has associated himself with this school and had published himself in the British papers and most of the papers that is the brain behind us. And we want to prove that we were not instigated by anybody, neither we want to refute any allegation that ACA or God knows what instigated us to carry out the school. This school was carried out completely because of the things that had happened in Ghana and because of the tyranny and the despotism of Kwame Nkrumah, the deposed president. Everybody in Ghana was fed up with it. And therefore you could see the spontaneous result which followed the coup. You would have seen when you were coming probably thinking that Ghana would have been put under curfew or all other things, but nothing was done. There was no brain behind it. It was work from us and from within, without the aid of anybody, any foreign country or any country. It has been some of these things in Ghana that when a ruler is useless, you depose him. And therefore, we have deposed Kwame Nkrumah. We don't want tyranny or anything here. And therefore, I would like to not waste time to bring in Amu here for you to see him.
The military regime of Kotoka Ankara Afrifa that assumed economic management of Ghana from 1966 to 1969 did not, for whatever reasons, deviate much from the strategies they inherited.
In 1966, Nkrumah was deposed by his own army. The same Ghanaians who had first worshipped him now turned on him. World cocoa prices had slumped, the state schemes had cost too much, foreign loans had stopped, and the country was bankrupt. The hopes his people had put in him lay shattered, only 10 years after independence.
Citizens of Ghana and fellow countrymen, good evening. The Ghana Armed Forces took over the reins of government of this country after a successful overthrow of the regime of Kwame Nkrumah in what may be truly described as one of the boldest ventures in the history of this country.
Hello, fans. Excuse me. Excuse the bristling about with weapons and the flushing in the face, but I've just come from dashing away from it, doing a bit of liberating. And overthrowing the government and all that business. Overthrowing the government is rather heavy going at the best of times, but my goodness, folks, this is a landmine in the history of Africa, no mistake.
The military coup won enormous popular support, and Nkrumah had failed to deliver the modern Ghana he had promised. The dam had come too late to save him. But there were other forces involved in planning the coup. America, too, had finally lost patience with Nkrumah.
Well, Howard Bain, who was the CIA station chief in Accra, engineered the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah. Now, obviously, you can look at it different ways. A Ghanaian might say, I thought we did it. Inside the CIA, though, it was quite clear Howard Bain got a double promotion and the Intelligence Star for having overthrown Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. The magic of it, what made it so exciting to the CIA, was that Howard Bain had had enough imagination and drive to run the operation without ever documenting what he was doing, and to sweep along his bosses in such a way they knew what he was doing, tacitly they approved, but there wasn't one shred of paper that he generated that would nail the CIA hierarchy as being responsible.
Nkrumah fled to Guinea and never returned to Ghana. He died in 1972. In the 1950s, in the eyes of the West, his country had been a radiant model for what Africa was to become. But by the time he fell, that image had been replaced by a picture of a continent racked by military coups and corruption. In the late 60s, Western journalists travelled to Ghana to pick over the bones of his industrial experiment. Their contemptuous reports seemed to confirm to the West a new myth of Africa, a continent unable to handle the complex pressures of industrialization.
Kwame Nkrumah, the communist messiah of Africa, came home in 1947 with the clothes he stood up in and a cardboard suitcase. He left 19 years later, a multimillionaire.
He turned a £250 million credit at independence to a £600 million debt, and he left Accra studded with expensive white elephants, such as this massive saluting base here in Black Star Square.
Today, Black Star Square, built by Nkrumah for mass parades to demonstrate enthusiasm for his rule, remains as a bleak reminder of his conceit.
Overlooking the square was Job 600, built by Nkrumah specially for the OAU conference in 1965. It's never been used since.
This luxury block was to house the Pan-African Congress. They never came.
There was the Accra-Tema motorway. Cost £6 million to duplicate a fast good road already in existence. They say the Russians actually managed to sell snowplows to this state in equatorial Africa.
For Ghana, the years following Nkrumah's fall were ones of economic failure. The dam worked well, but the industrial world that was to have sprung up around it failed to materialise. Those Ghanaians who had been moved to make way for the dam found themselves stranded in the wreckage of Nkrumah's dream.
I become quite disgusted because we are directly about 3 miles from the Volta Dam, but we don't have power, no electricity, no water. So my feeling is that when we have these things, we can do so much to help the nation.
The River Volta has been caught and put to work. In the rock gorge at Akosombo, 60 miles inland from Accra, a hydroelectric dam is virtually completed. 6 massive penstocks, pipes, channel the water down through 6 turbines. The middle 2 are working already. Then the water passes out into the heaving pool below. The 6 turbines drive 6 generators, and these produce electric power which they send humming to the switchyard a quarter of a mile away on the same right bank. At full load, any one of the generators can produce twice the electricity now consumed in the whole of Ghana. But the electricity is sent away down to the coast, where the Ghana government, busily exchanging old problems for new, are importing industries to use it, aluminium first. The Volta River project is the realization of an old dream. A man who has charted most of its progress is Mr. James Moxon, a former British colonial servant who's now not merely a Ghanaian, but a card-carrying Ghanaian chief, a figure of prestige, if not power, with stick and robe and stool of office to match.
When did the paperwork on this particular project begin?
Well, in fact, I was district commissioner of the Volta River district when the idea was first being explored. And Duncan Rose, who was a South African mining engineer, was plumbing the depths of the river in order to find out whether it was physically and geologically possible to build a dam. In fact, we used to meet frequently and discuss it. That was in 1946.
And that was the beginning of the idea of the dam?
No, the idea, in fact, came about 30 years before that, in 1915, when Sir Albert Kitson, who was the first Director of Geological Surveys in the Gold Coast, first of all discovered bauxite, and then the following year found, quite by chance, on a canoe trip down the river, the very site at Akosombo where the dam has now been built.
Upstream from Akosombo, the problems of the area Mr. Moxon struggled with as district commissioner are now largely settled. It's all underwater. In 2 or 3 years' time, we're told, this will be the largest man-made lake in the world, 250 miles long and reaching far back into the country's northern uplands. It'll have its uses. There are boats on it already, and there'll be more for cheap inland transport. Passenger traffic, crops, ore from the hills. Fishing boats will multiply too. But there were villages here before. 65,000 people have already been moved, and there are more to go under the persuasions of resettlement officers.
Well, this is Mr. Amuhia. He calls himself Amuhia or Amushia or ever. His name is never spelled correct either. And we would like him to tell you how he organized this coup and how he was the brain behind it. And who he knew on this.
First and foremost, on the 24th morning, 8 o'clock news announced in London that Ghana has announced that jointly the army and the police have overthrown the regime of the tyrant, Kwame Nkrumah.
Did you come to brainwash me, Kotoka, the police, or somebody and tell us how to conduct this? Or did you try to tell us where we should, how we should organize our army or the operations to be carried out?
No, sir. This is exactly what I am coming to, sir. If I should be given the opportunity, I shall explain thoroughly as I am before you and before the world press.
General Ankara can squash a mayor, but will he make a national leader?
Of course, he's a very, very experienced soldier. He rose from the ranks. He served in India and Burma during the war as a warrant officer. After the war, he was commissioned and rose steadily up to be a major general. He was retired a few months ago and, of course, has now been brought back as commander of the forces.
He was really kicked out by Nkrumah.
Yes, it was never announced in so many words. In fact, he took the initiative to resign, but he's always been a very popular figure, and he's certainly a remarkably fine general, and I think will be a very good leader.
Do you expect him to stay in charge of Ghana, or do you think
that I don't know at all. One doesn't know how long these military regimes have to last. Well, the new council have described it by saying that he seemed to act as though Ghana was his personal property, which perhaps amounts to the same sort of thing. But these sort of feelings tend to build up, and I think people appear to be ready for a change of government. And of course, in this type of government, the only way you can get a change of government is by overthrow.
The overthrow of Nkrumah brought public jubilation in Accra, in sharp contrast to Ghana's near neighbor, Nigeria. When the army took over there in January, there was simply a stunned acceptance by the public. Nothing like this. Outside Fort Usher prison, the crowd are waiting for the release of more of Nkrumah's political prisoners.
What did you have mainly against Kwame Nkrumah?
Because he has taken our money away, over 195 million pounds away, and we are not broke. Oh, yeah, we are fed up with him. We are fed up.
Yes.
Yes.
What is the lady waiting for?
Well, is happy.
Is happy.
Answering the question I said before. He's very, very happy.
Are you happy too?
I'm very happy. Look, if my brother is in the jail yard now. I'm waiting for my brother.
Yeah.
Yes.
How long has he been detained?
About 3 years or 5 years. 5 years. 5 years.
What was he detained for?
For political reason. And I don't know what my brother has done. What he has done.
He was detained because he was a political opponent of Nkrumah.
Of Nkrumah, of course, yes.
Among the released men this day, Mr. Kobler Atto, former publicity secretary of the Band United Party.
Mr. Atto, when were you arrested and for what reason?
10th November 1958. And the government declared reasons were that we were planning the forceful overthrow of the government. But the real reason was that this was the first time that you had a real opposition in Accra against the government party, and they were afraid we were going to beat them in Accra, and they thought they must do something about it, and the only way they could do it was to remove us from among the people.
How many of the members of your party were put in jail?
There were 42 of us. Actually, there were to be 43, but one man was not arrested at all. And one old man among us died when we were in detention. That was in 1960 he died.
What sort of treatment did you have?
The treatment varied. At first, we were treated fairly well. Then in 1960, when the government decided that they have to break up our party in Ashanti, where also we have strong and widespread support, they declared that some people were engaged in gangsterism and they were criminals. And when they arrested the people, they turned out to be mostly members and officials of our party, especially chiefs and traditional men in Ashanti who were chairmen of our party in various villages. They were treated very brutally. They were beaten up. Some of them were more than 70 years, and even there were 2 or 3 who were more than 80. They were beaten. They were often stripped naked and searched.
This is on arrival in the prison?
Oh, yes. On the first arrival, in the reception room, they were slapped and beaten, kicked. And then from there, they were hurried along, pushed or beaten to the cells. And from time to time, the doors were opened and they were beaten, abused, and humiliated in all manner of ways.
From prison conditions in Accra, 130 miles north now, to another symptom of Nkrumah's regime, a training camp for African saboteurs, a closely guarded secret up till last Sunday, when the new regime opened the gates to the world's press. Until that day, even the local police hadn't been allowed in. The students inside were never allowed out.
This is a freedom fighters camp which was set up by the Kwame Nkrumah government and has been today opened to the press by the new government of Ghana. It had, before, about 6 months ago, about 11 Chinese instructors. They're not here today. It also had Ghanaian instructors and recruits from various African countries. Countries like South Africa and Rhodesia with so-called colonial governments. But it also had recruits from countries, independent African countries, neighbors of Ghana in some cases. The inference of today's visit is that the new Ghana government doesn't intend to follow the old policies of President Nkrumah, which they would consider to be interfering in one's neighbors' affairs and trying to subvert other African states.
20 trainee saboteurs were found here. They said they'd been lured from neighboring countries with the promise of scholarships, then taught Chinese communist doctrine, guerrilla tactics, and the use of explosives. Could it happen again in Ghana? What are the chances of Nkrumah now staging a comeback from Guinea?
I think it'd be very unwise to try, because I don't think he'd be well received. The public opinion has manifested itself very quickly in the last 2 or 3 days.
As being against him?
Yes, the public opinion has manifested itself as being against some of the policies which have affected the public. I mean, in certain respects, of course, his policies are Ghanaian policies, but in certain respects, particularly in relation to the economic situation, I think people felt that too much money had been spent on prestige symbols and perhaps too little on keeping the cost of living within bounds. This is the sort of thing that worries the man in the street.
Ghana's future may now depend on released United Party prisoners like Mr. Atto.
There's no vacuum in nature, and the same in human affairs. So I shall certainly be in politics. As a matter of fact, people have been telling me and many of my friends that they expect us to do better than these people, and I don't think we're going to disappoint them.
What sort of Ghana would you yourself work for now?
I have been brought up in ideas of British democracy, and before I went to prison, the people I associated with were people who thought the same, and I'm sure that they still hold those views. If you ask me what sort of ism I believe in, I say I believe in kind of socialism like that of the British Labour Party. And that is the opinion, the views of the members of the UP. And I think that's what they like. They won't have anything to do with anything called communism. They hate it. In the prison, anybody was a UP member hated communism. And we wouldn't have it at all.
General, may I ask you a question?
Yes.
Sandy Gall, Independent Television News, London. When approximately do you expect free elections to be held in Ghana?
Oh, that is too early to answer. As you know, within this week, general election can only be carried out after we've got the, as I said, we've got the Constitution. I mean, this Constitution, we don't want to have a dictatorship again, and therefore the Constitution will come out when everybody in the country has been given the privilege to bring about what he thinks must be embodied in the Constitution, and the Constitution has been referred to on a referendum and probably approved by the Council.
General Ankara's first priority must be to rescue Ghana from bankruptcy.
General, it's been said that this country is going to run out of money by April. What do you intend to do about that? Are you going to ask for aid from the United States?
It's within the Economic Commission.
Do you expect that you will ask for aid from the United States?
We'll ask for aid from all countries so far.
General, do you plan to reopen diplomatic relations with Britain?
Why not? I may say why not, but we are members of the Commonwealth, and it depends on the OAU decisions, which we've sent members there now.
What happens to former President Nkrumah if he comes back here?
Oh, well, definitely we don't intend to share blood, and you'll realize that even his wife we save and send back. If he comes back here, we'll only have to try him for the actual things he has done.
When Nkrumah came to power, Ghana had £200 million in the bank. Today, she has debts of $250 million. So Ghana needs sane rule fast. At present, like many other African states, she's under direct army control. But she's in no mood now for more dictatorship. Ghana's problem is to find a formula to edge back into democracy without falling into chaos.